Hi from Berlin. My name is Mike Coburn, and as you can see here, I'm a PhD candidate in political science at the Freie Universität in the Graduate School of American Studies. First of all, thanks a lot for organising this conference. I think this is a really cool idea, an innovative way to deal with the problem that we have around conferences at the moment. My PhD project looks at changes in US congressional primaries, and I'm going to discuss with you today one of those changes, namely the rise of ideology within these contests. So let's get started. So first of all, we like to talk about the puzzle that we're trying to solve within political science. And the puzzle that I'm looking at here is to understand why the numbers and also the voter engagement in congressional primary contests has increased in the past decade or so, at a time when we've seen highly unified parties within Congress. And I'm going to make the case today that the answer to that is due to what I've termed a transformation into ideological primaries. So I'm just going to go quickly here through the structure of the different parts that I'm going to talk about today. So first of all, I'm going to show you some evidence that the numbers of contested primaries and voter engagement have increased in these contests. Next, I'm then going to outline what I mean by transformation with particular attention to ideological difference. I'll give you an overview of the method that I'm using here, of course present you some results, and then finally give you a bit of insight into why I think some of these changes are happening. So first of all, looking at evidence of increased engagement. So these four graphs here, starting with figure 1, we're looking there at the number of contested primaries. So the data set I use is an original data set that I've created for all contests and all nomination contests over the last 7 electoral cycles, so from 2006 to 2018, looking then at when they're contested, and the first thing we can say is that we see a trend in the number of contested races. So for something to be a contested race in this data set, it requires 2 names on the ballot, and we can see here there's a big spike in the Republican numbers, particularly for the House. The data for the Senate, obviously there's many fewer contests in the Senate, but in the House we see a big spike in 2010 with the entrance of these Tea Party supported candidates. But what's important here is that number doesn't revert back to the kind of 2006, 2008 levels after that influx. For the Democrats, we see a bit of a spike in 2012, when obviously they're expecting to have a good election year, but then the number of contests really spikes in 2018 when we see this kind of influx of progressives into the party. As you might expect, when we move over to figure 2 here, when you have more contests, you are going to have more candidates in them. But of course, it's good just to separate those out as they're not entirely the same. But of course, we see a similar pattern there. And in the bottom 2 graphs, starting with figure 3, we're then looking there at the voter engagement. So the number of voters in the Republican contests obviously spikes in 2010, but again, it does not go back down to, does not revert to the kind of pre-transformation levels. Of course, we do see slightly different numbers for presidential year turnout when there's a contested presidential race on the ballot as well. But again, with the Democrats, while we do see that fluctuation between 2006 and 2014, after 2014, we see a huge increase in the number of voters in contested House primaries. We note here for the Senate in figure 4 that the data is a little noisier. We'll see that pattern repeat in this data later. This is again because we're dealing with a much smaller n, but also we're dealing with different states up for election each time. So why have these changes happened? So I'm going to put forward here this theory of transformation. So my argument is broadly that prior to these transformative periods, the nature of congressional primary contests looked very different. So in the pre-transformed era, these were largely contests taking place between candidates who thought that they were the most qualified person within the local party to be the representative in the general election. These were highly localized races, which did not focus very much on policy, certainly on national policy. So they may have featured debates about the building of, for example, a road or a school, but they wouldn't have featured debates about national education or infrastructure policy. As a result, it means they focus a lot on what are termed valence factors. So what we're talking about here is level of competence and experience within the candidate base. Looking at that. As a result, the argument here is that these comparatively waste resources. So the people funding these contests would have given money to the party regardless, and that money could have been better used in a November general election against the alternative party. The argument here being that these candidates are primarily being funded from within the party. Another trend is that quite often these even non-incumbents have had some form of prior elected public office. So whether that be in city council or in state government, they have some kind of experience there. And the final argument is that these tend to be quite divisive because of the focus on valence factors. Quite often these contests focus on the personality of the candidates involved, and so can turn negative and become quite divisive. So my argument is that after they transform, these contests then become faction oriented. So with candidates who have allegiances to different groups competing on issues of national policy and featuring extensive policy content. That means that instead of focusing on valence factors, they focus intently on issues, which has the potential to attract resources from groups outside of the party, bringing those resources into the party. Alongside this, we note that because of these allegiances to groups, these groups are supporting candidates who are not have not previously held public office, but have come from other areas. And because of this attraction of outside resources into the party system, these can have the possibility of being mobilizing. So today, obviously, we've got a lot of different features there. I'm really going to focus just on the ideological element of this, which obviously forms one chapter of the PhD thesis. So how did I conduct the analysis I'm about to show you? So I created an original data set of all congressional primaries between 2006 and 2018, and then I profiled them based on two criteria. So the first criteria is what I've termed primary factionalism. So here I created 4 ideal types, which I've labeled progressive left, establishment Democrats, establishment Republicans, and new right. And then I assigned all candidates who finished first or second in a contested primary to one of those factional ideal types. What that means is then I can code whether the primary was between candidates who are proximate to different factions or to the same factions. And when they are proximate to different factions, I've coded the primary as factional. In addition to this, I coded the reason for contest. So this was based on a code set developed by Robert Boatwright in answer to the question, why are you running for Congress? So looking to understand why the contest was taking place. In Boatwright's system, he just applies it to incumbent races, but I've then gone and applied that same system to all races. So what have I found? So firstly, looking at factionalism in the House, we can see here that the rate of factionalism it increases during this period. So as we saw in those previous graphs, we see a spike in on the Republican side of factional primaries, both in terms of as a percentage on the left and also in terms of raw numbers on the right. We see a big spike in 2010, but importantly, as with the previous graphs, we do not see a reversion to the 2006-2008 levels following that. For the Democrats, again, we see that this pattern, this increase happens much later. So the numbers of factional primaries, but also the percentage of primaries that are taking place between candidates proximate to different ideal types increases much later. So as I said before, the Senate data tends to be slightly messier, but again, especially if we look at the raw numbers, we can see a similar pattern in the long dashed line there on the Republican side, and then the thick blue line on the Democratic side. Then next, for the reason for contest, so what we're really interested in here, particularly given the focus of today's talk, is the orange ideology line. So we see that there is a huge increase on the Republican side, which is the left graph, in 2010, and then a slight decline, but kind of maintaining high numbers of contests taking place for reasons of ideology. Similarly, on the Democratic side, this then starts to increase from 2016 and into 2018. Interestingly, the blue line is this idea of competence or age as being the dominant factor within the primary. So this really speaks to the idea that valence factors tend to decline. So after 2010 in the Republican Party, and then kind of this divergence from 2016 to 2018 in the Democratic primaries. The dotted grey line underneath is when national issues dominate the primary. So again, in both we see that they increase later in the time series. And then again for the Senate, so we can see in the Republican side that even in 2006, ideology is pretty dominant as the reason for contest. But again, we do still see the same pattern of this lump from 2010 and then kind of an increase again in 2018. And then again for the Democrats, that pattern is just later with ideology emerging as the main reason for contest further down the line. So why has this happened? I make the case that this has happened for three reasons, which kind of produce results which intersect. So the first of these reasons is changes in electoral incentives. So this has primarily been driven by polarization, and more specifically than that, these concepts that I've written down here. So negative partisanship. So that's the idea that as well as rather than liking your party more, it's actually that you hate the other party much, much more. At the same time, we've seen a trend of hyper-competitive national elections, so both in Congress and over the presidency. We've been living in what Morris Fiorina terms as an era of tenuous majorities. But at the same time, at a local level, we've seen a big increase in the number of safe seats that are taking place, meaning that in many more places, the primary is the only site of genuine democratic contestation. Alongside this, there's been a number of regulatory and technological changes. So these regulatory changes include acts like the McCain-Feingold Act in 2002, and then the Citizens United Supreme Court decision in 2010, which basically open up funding sources to outsiders. A similar process has taken place in terms of technological changes with ability of non-traditional party sources to raise money online. So these have produced a number of structural and strategic party responses, what Seth Maskett terms as the growth of the informal party organization, meaning that the concept of how the parties and the structure of how the parties exist has undergone some fundamental shifts, and that those shifts have taken place with focus on the nomination itself. So this has one downstream effect, that it impacts the types of candidates doing well. So obviously, if you're a candidate with outsider support, suddenly you are now much more able to succeed. At the same time, it's also fostered a number of changes in primary voter engagement. So not just the numbers of voters, but also the criteria by which primary voters assess candidates. And of course, that has also been directly impacted by these changes in electoral incentives. And of course, the fact that voters have changed their criteria then loops back and feeds into kind of the strategic responses of the parties themselves. And so, in conclusion, I think there's structural evidence that changes are not temporary responses to short-term events, such as the election of Obama and then Trump, but that the evidence from the Republican Party has shown that we don't experience a reversion to the previous state after that takes place, and that ideological differences now dominate these intra-party contests and look set to do so for the future. Thank you very much.